All right.
I
And
know
with
Tim
that,
Emery has a question.
I know he does. Where is it? There he is.
There he is.
All
He's
right.
gonna
So
write one.
with that, welcome and thank you all for joining us for our weekly edition of what we call Talkback. What is Talkback? Thank you for asking. Talkback is just that, talking back to the proclaimer for the morning. It's an opportunity to ask those questions, get a little more clarity, or even dig a little bit deeper into the things we heard in worship or in the sermon. So you can, and you're in person, you can fill out cards to jot those questions down. If you are joining us virtually, we invite you to email us your questions at talkback@myersparkbaptist.org. Again, if we don't get to your question today, when we have it written down or email, we can still respond to make sure that your question is acknowledged, okay? So today we have none other than our very own pastor, the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Boswell.
Oh my goodness, yes, the whole thing.
Y'all didn't know that W, did you?
Oh boy.
I'll leave it there.
Listen, you said it was going to be talk back, not back talk. We got to...
You picked the wrong host for that. The first question, the W, what is it now? Okay. All right, let me stop wasting time and get into, we've got a great bit of questions here today. So to start with, we do have a word of thanks. And this message simply says this is for Lieutenant Cornelius. Thank you for your sermon today. It shows us the power that we can change. What an uplifting message. Thank you for showing us the way. So thank you, Lieutenant Cornelius.
Thank you. Lieutenant Cornelius, I love it.
I think we can start calling him that, right? The centurion.
I don't want to be named after that military general.
You're the one that joined the military, not me.
That's true. That was my fault.
So this first question, or more of a statement that I have, this person says, I'd love to be able to tell people that while Peter had to hear things multiple times before he got it, it also seems to take us multiple times to hear a message before we get it. They encourage us also to stay conversational. So you uplifted that portion about Peter and the three times, and Peter is not a stranger to that. Tell us a little bit about Peter having to hear this message multiple times and what that may mean for us.
Well, I certainly think it means that we shouldn't expect people to get it on the first time around. It's sort of like a communication thing. We just heard yesterday from some folks that used to be that you had to tell people things 7 times, but now communicators are saying you have to tell people, 18, 20, 35 times before they get something, which reminds me of a great joke. So I'll tell this. I probably shouldn't use this because I could use it in a sermon, but anyway. So there's this new Methodist pastor who comes to his first appointment, his first church, and he's appointed there by the bishop. And the first week that he's on the job, there's a funeral, and then the next week after that, there's a funeral, and the next week after that, there's a funeral, and he can't get to writing a sermon, so he preaches the same sermon 2, 3, 4 weeks in a row, and the people just get so tired of hearing this sermon that they call the bishop, and they said, we don't know why you appointed this pastor here and to come over here. They preach the same sermon every week for 4 weeks, and the bishop said, what was it about? And they couldn't tell him, so he said, go back and tell the pastor to preach it one more time. I think sometimes it takes a while for a message to sink in, I think that's why honestly, the gospel, we've heard these same stories. How many times have we heard these stories? All our lives, many of us, and yet sometimes they can be brand new, as if we've never heard them before. And I think that's part of what creative worship can do, and I think that's our role. That's my role as a clergy person, as a pastor, as a preacher, is to try to take the text and make it seem fresh and new. So it's like we've never heard it before, but also it's the 8th or 38th time, and it sinks in finally what's really going on in that passage. And so it takes work to do that. But I think the beauty of Peter is he's just so human. He's like a representative of all the disciples, all the apostles of this path where, we try. I like the fact that Peter always tries, but Peter almost always messes up every time he tries. And so it's sort of this beautiful image of what church is and what following Jesus is like. It's trying really hard and knowing that we're going to make mistakes and stumble and fall and drown and, get it wrong. I mean, I sometimes think about, how did Peter still not know that Gentiles were going in by chapter 10? I mean, how long does it take? How many times you got to hear that, right? And so it takes a heavenly picnic blanket coming down with all the animals and, things on there that he'd never eaten before. And 3 times, up and down, for Peter to finally get what's been going on since Jesus' ministry, right? It's not that the Gentile thing is new in Acts. Jesus was doing that also, crossing these boundaries, crossing the thresholds, crossing the lines, breaking the law to hang out with Gentiles. And for some reason, they just didn't get it. It was like it takes multiple iterations of the Spirit's blowing in and shaking it up for them to finally get it. Even like Paul gets it really before Peter does. And Paul was outside the church killing Christians, right? So it's really wild to watch that. I think what it helps me to look at, it helps me to look at the church now and to see so many Christians, just not getting it at all, right? Especially in America with this sort of, we're all kind of coming to realize how many people are trapped in the ideology of Christian nationalism. It's like how many of them just didn't. There can't be Christian nationalism. Those two words don't go together, in my opinion. There's no such thing as Christian nationalism. I know that's a category we're using now. But you can't be Christian and nationalistic, right? The faith is not American. Right? It's not American. It doesn't belong to America. And people who are in the community of faith are in the community of faith with everybody in the community of faith around the world. Therefore, we can't be Christian national. That doesn't even make any sense. But because there's so many people trapped in that, we can look out at the world and we can look at Peter and we can say, okay, I get what people still don't get it. They still don't get it, and that was predicted for us. That was told to us already, that there will be many times, many people who don't get it, first, second, third, 2,000th time that they hear it. And it's kind of like the seed, the parable of the seed. Sometimes the seed gets thrown. Sometimes it grows, it falls on fertile soil. Sometimes it doesn't. Yeah.
So thinking about this, and I appreciate you naming that humanness of Peter, because that is really what can resonate with us. But this message that keeps getting repeated to Peter and some others that is not really quite getting caught up is this message that you had for us too about community, right, and beloved community. And that leads to this question where someone says, okay, so but what are the first steps to building a spiritual community with family, with friends? What makes that beloved community? What are the steps in your opinion?
As I was working on this sermon, I was rereading a book by M. Scott Peck. Some know M. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled. M. Scott Peck also wrote this really interesting book on community called The Different Drummer, or The Different Drum, I think is what it's called. In that book, it's a whole book about times that M. Scott Peck felt community and then times where he was a part of building community. And then it's a book about community. What is community, and how do you build community? And in that book, he has what he calls the stages of community, which I think are very interesting to think through how a community is formed and how things go from being just people gathered in some space to true community. And he has like these phases. Pseudo-community, sort of his first phase, that's where like it's just kind of interactions between people, and they're kind of shallow generally. And then there's like, he feels like the development of community goes through these phases of pseudo-community, chaos. I wrote them down just so I wouldn't forget. Pseudo-community, chaos, emptiness, and then community. In the chaos period, that's when people realize and actually wrestle with their differences. That's the chaos period. It's kind of like group forming, storming, norming. Y'all have heard that? The chaos period of community is when you actually get real about how different you are. And then there's a move to emptiness. And the emptiness part is where we give up the pridefulness that makes it impossible for us to get community, where we demand that the community meet all my needs and be my community and not ours. That's the emptiness. And then we get to the fourth stage, which is community. So it's almost psychological, sociological, I guess, of these phases of sort of superficial people just coming together and talking and not really having community, very surface level, to like chaos where it's like, oh no, that's what you think? That's who you are? I don't know if I even want to talk to you anymore, right? To then, I'm going to give up what I need to give up in order for us to be in relation, right? I'm going to self-empty of something that is needed, and then we move into community. So that's kind of the phases. I don't know if that's right, but that was one model, that's out there for community. There are a lot of articles on this. I thought about sharing some with the church in the weeks ahead, because there have been some folks, particularly since the pandemic, who are wrestling with the question, what is community? It used to be that we knew the ingredients. People gathered together in a particular place for a particular purpose, right? Like that we kind of thought that was what community was. But now it's not all about being in the same place, right? Communities being formed in many, many different ways. The other threat to what we understand as community at church is everybody is using that word very flippantly. You know, like I was watching TV and it was like, we're all in the T-Mobile community. What community is that? You all have the same cell phone, so y'all are community? You know, like the T-Mobile community, right? But then there's all these other ways, and we're just flippantly throwing this word out. So then it starts to become the kind of thing where we don't really know what it means anymore. It's like love. Love this, love that. And then we're like, what's love really? Community's following the same way. Everything's community. Social community, online community, T-Mobile community, community. But there's no definition. There's no common definition of what it means to be community. And if I said the only community you get to be in is the T-Mobile community, that's not going to be sufficient for you, right? That's not going to be the community that's going to make you feel belonging. So that's where I think the difference between what the kind of community that beloved community or the kind of community we're trying to create here is it has these stages of development where it goes from you're just people in a collection, you know, interacting, to you care about each other. Here are the ingredients, I think. You care for each other. You share things in common with each other. And you have a common purpose or mission, right? A community is people who care for each other, who come together, who share things, who have a common purpose and common mission. That to me is where the starts to build. And then what happens in that, to me, where you really feel the sense of community, I don't even think we should use that word anymore. I think the word belonging is better. I think that's what people really mean when they say community. They mean they belong. They know they belong to someone. That's how family. I belong to my wife. I belong to my daughter. I belong to my mother and my father. They belong to me, right? We belong to each other. That's my daughter, right? You know, we should also be able to say, you know, that's my Carla in church. That's my Carla, you know? Well, she might be your Carla too, but she's my Carla, right? She's family.
She's really my Carla.
I know
actually.
She's your Carla. Yes. But, you know, do you see what I'm saying? Like, that's mine, we're mine, and I'm yours. That's belonging, right? When we're at that point with each other. And so I think church struggles to create that sense. One prophet within our midst once asked me, is this place a safe place to bring my pain? Is this a safe place to bring my pain? Pain. Is it a place I can bring my pain? If it's not, then are we really a community? I don't know. So, and I think there are always ebbs and flows in this. We can go from being community to not community to being community again. And we're never going to get it all right. We're never going to be perfect. It's going to be like fits and starts and glimpses and moments, and we're moments of beloved community, and then the next week we're in conflict, and the next week we're beloved community, and then in conflict. I think that's life. That's how a family is. That's how relationships are. The commitment, though, to try to keep building a place where people feel like they belong is, I think, part of what the church is called to do.
Great. That reminds me of two things. One of our own members here that many of you may know too, Dr. Anita Blanchard's work on, let me hope I get the word right in case she's watching, entativity.
I think it's entativity.
Entativity. It's a lot of but a lot of the same concepts as Peck in terms of what exactly makes a difference between a bunch of individuals together versus them feeling like a cohesive community or group or unit, because I can stand in the midst of a crowd and still not feel like I'm part of any of that. So we'll have to get Dr. Blanchard over here to do some work. For those who can't
pronounce the word, they can say groupiness.
So she can say it. Okay, so she can say it for us.
Yeah. Well, she says groupiness. How groupy is a group?
How groupy is the group? The second thing is we always talk a lot about building community, but we don't talk a lot about maintaining community, right? Like you just said, like the ebbs and flows, because when we start talking about conflict management, when we start talking about accountability, that's when all of a sudden people shy away a little bit from this idea of community, because don't hold me accountable to the community.
Right.
But be my community for me when I need you. Right. So very good. Very good question there.
Yeah.
So as we get a little more specific about this idea of community and building community at this church, someone asked in general, would one good idea would be maybe having a collection on Sundays, or from a cash collection, having that go to our Sunshine Fund. For those who don't know, we have a Sunshine Fund here at Myers Park Baptist Church that goes to those who are in need or in crisis, where we can activate some of those funds and be community for people that come in for all kinds of needs: clothing, food, transportation, things like that. So is that a good idea of what it means to be active in this kind of community, or do you have other ideas of what that could look like here at Myers Park?
I think that's our form of what we would call mutual aid inside the community of faith now. As you give to the Sunshine Fund, you're giving that for members who are in financial crisis. That's what we use it for primarily. Members of our own community who go through struggles, we have that fund, which, remember, we take up the offering on Christmas Eve. It goes there. We have some endowments that drop a little bit of money in there. And then people give directly to the Sunshine Fund. And we're able to help people that way. That is a good way, I think, to help people in our community. Now, it's all anonymous, so you're never going to know who's struggling. So if you're okay with the anonymous part of it and not really knowing who your money is going to help, because we can't, release that information. It's private for those folks who are going through struggles. But that is a way to help. I think there are a lot of other ways. I think as you get to know members of your community, as you participate in programs that are more community driven, like like the senior adult lunch, or Wednesday night dinner, which we're going to have, and faith formation programming and spiritual growth opportunities, and then even just worship. You get to know people more, then you can find out really what's going on in their lives, and there's ways people will open up and let you know ways that you can help them. And it doesn't have to be very huge. It doesn't have to be very big for people to feel like they're starting to build that bond of trust and belonging and community together. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can be that for each other. The church, for years has been calling people on their birthdays and on the days they've joined the church. We have a group of people who do that. That's pretty important. I think that really actually does help people feel like, oh, they remember me, they care about me, they think of me. I'm not just another person in a pew. I'm not a number to them. I'm a whole being, who has birthdays and remembers anniversaries and all that. So one of the things I think we're talking about a lot as a staff and as deacons is, what can we do to be there with people in their most difficult and their most joyous moments in life. And you'll remember a sermon I preached at the beginning of the year that talked about, we have a theology that is elastic enough that we can go beyond the table and beyond the baptismal font to create rituals that are for people who are going through difficulties or joys that ordinarily are not touched by the church. So, for instance, where's the ritual for folks going through a divorce? Where's the ritual for folks who've gone through a miscarriage? Where's the ritual for folks who are retiring? Where's the ritual for folks moving into assisted living? Right? Where are those rituals where we can connect with people as they're going through those threshold moments in life where everything's changing and everything's going to be different, and be there with them in those, because the church has not made those sacred events. It has had communion, it has had baptism. Those have been the sacred rituals of the tradition. And it had weddings, right? But it hasn't had these other things that have expanded to deal with what's really going on in people's lives in the 21st century. What about job loss right now? That is a major event in someone's life. When someone loses that job, where are we in that? Where is the ritual for that? How do we hold people? And the church, what the church has the opportunity to provide is not just being there for them, but to help them feel God's presence, right? And the community all holding them and providing meaning in the midst of the most difficult things that they're experiencing, or the most joyous. What are the joys that we're not celebrating with people that we could? So that's, I think, something we could do better on as well.
Very good. Excellent. So we look forward to implementing all of that tomorrow. Very good.
On demand, yes, yes.
So as we talk about these joys and griefs and things that we need to address as a community, there are some challenges, and you raised some in your sermon, one of which being that human nature of partiality. And that leads to this question here where someone says, does our partiality with other people come from a partiality within ourselves, of our different parts, that we deny compassion of our ancestors, that we refuse to integrate into our being? That's a good one.
Whew. Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm glad it's asking you and not me.
My goodness. You know, it's really profound, a really profound question and an important one. And it makes me think about Carl Jung, who many of you in this church have studied for years, and the work of the shadow work is what we call it. But all therapists use this now because Jung was so important. But the work of integrating ourselves with our darkness, our demons, our shadow side, the side of ourselves that we don't love. Usually it's sometimes like it's a little child version of ourselves that was left alone, isolated, emotionally manipulated, hurt, harmed, abused, treated with neglect or distress, or that was made fun of or was excluded, and loving that part of ourselves, learning to go back and love that child. I don't want to give everybody therapy here today, but give that little child, embrace that child who was not loved in the way they needed to be loved, right? Because they were raised by imperfect people who could not possibly love them the way that everybody needs to be loved all the time, exactly the right way. So how do we do that and integrate ourselves, start to love the parts of us that look to us like they're broken? They're really probably not, but they look to us like they're messed up or ugly or broken or we don't like about ourselves or that we're afraid of. That's the shadow part that we don't want, and integrate ourselves to become whole. That's the work of all the therapy work that we do, spiritual work that we do, is the work of integration with all the parts of ourselves so that they're one. And there's not part of us that we're denying and pretending doesn't exist and hating and pushing off to the side. So yes, I think the question is 100% right. Part of the reason why we are partial is because there is something in us that has not been integrated yet. And therefore we don't have the empathy for those who are outside the margins, because we are denying our own reality, right? It's sort of like the person who is very suppressed in their sexuality that is homophobic, right? Because they have not integrated their sexual identity with themselves, right? And so because they have not integrated that in themselves, they hate, they don't just hate, they're not just homophobic, they're not sex positive. They don't like sex, right? So they just haven't integrated that part of themselves, and therefore they're very, standoffish or hate-filled or mean or oppressive to people who they see liberated, right? In that way. They don't like that. It's kind of like it's like a all of us have to struggle with that, like inner Puritan. The Puritans are unhappy if anybody's happy, right? If anybody's happy, they're unhappy, right? So like, how do we, and so it's interesting, we talk about it, we call it integration, this like holistic work that we're doing in therapy, in spiritual life, in prayer, in meditation, trying to integrate. It's actually for our liberation, not just for our integration. And it's also, we're doing that. Somebody says, I don't know what to do for the cause of the poor or the oppressed in America. Get yourself right. Your liberation leads to theirs, right? When we're liberated people, we don't have a problem with other people's liberation. We don't keep other people out on the margins. We don't exclude other people when we're not excluding parts of ourselves. So I think there's something really, really genius about the way that question is framed. There's usually, when we're hating others, there's usually something unintegrated in ourselves that we haven't figured out what to deal with. We see this a lot when we talk to folks about parts of our mission that people are not comfortable with around LGBTQ or around race and whiteness. It's usually a part of themselves that they don't want to look at. I don't want to look at that history. I don't want to look at my story, how I was raised, how I was formed into patriarchy, into homophobia, into imperialism, into American nationalism. Kind of talked about some of that in my sermon today. I don't want to look at how I was formed in that. And because I don't want to look at that, I'm going to have a real problem with anybody else who either wants me to look at that or forces me to look at it because of their identity. Right? There's that the trans poem I used a couple weeks ago by the woman from Africa, where it was like just their existence of trans people makes people who are homophobic and transphobic feel like their existence is an offense to them. Yeah. That's because they haven't done their work, right? On their own sexuality, their own identity, why they were formed in these homophobic and transphobic tendencies to get to that point where they feel that they have to hate those folks. So I think that's a really profound question. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. It sounds like a lot of just basically some introspection
Right.
is really necessary to do that work. But I think what you're getting at and what the question got at really answers that question. Like you said, when people themselves are sexually fluid or have a different sexual identity, but they're homophobic, right?
Yeah.
Or even when people of color and black people look at someone else who is and say something's wrong with you because they've internalized a lot of that and haven't dealt with it within themselves. So yeah, that's really profound.
I think it happens every one of us struggles with this, even if we seem to be the most open-minded person in the world. I'll just give a little insight into Ben Boswell. Janelle Monáe, who some of you know as an artist, just came out with a new album. It's called The Age of Pleasure. There is no way to listen to that album and not be jealous of her liberation, in my opinion. Janelle Monáe is liberated.
Yes.
Liberated. Sexually, racially, gender, just liberated person singing about her sexual liberation. There's no way not to be like, man, what would the world be like if that was it?
And talented. And just talented.
Right, yeah. So, put the album on by your pool, by the pool, and see if you're not jealous of her liberation. That sometimes is how it works. Like we are intimidated by liberated people. So what we want to do is to shut them down and tell them there's something wrong with you. Something wrong with this liberation. We're going to put you in a box. We're going to put some laws and some boundaries and some borders up to shut you down because we can't handle your liberation. It scares the hell out of us. And so we're just going to do whatever we can to put you in a box. That's what the world is trying to do.
Oh, yeah. And that did happen to them. They do.
Yeah.
To Janelle Monáe. Trust me, a lot of church people push back on them.
I bet they do.
It was interesting time in social media when that album dropped. I love it, by the way.
It's a great album.
So here's another question, because you also talked about this idea of transgression in your sermon. So we want to hear a little bit about that and get some definitions. But this question said, should our Lord's Prayer that we do here be thank you for your trespasses, trespassing our boundaries, and forgive us for our lack of trespasses? So what are your thoughts on this play with language here?
Oh, yeah. I love that. Transgressions, of course, is a word that has been used for sin. As trespasses has also been used for sin. So I was using it intentionally with a double meaning today because I think it's helpful for us to see that sin is a construct. And sin is a construct created by whoever's in power. So what is sin is determined, even in the Bible, when you look at the Bible in the first century, sin is a construct determined by the people in religious power at the time. Sinners were whoever they decided were not in. And therefore anything that they did was sin. So that's the same now. That's the same. Sin is a construct created by the powerful. So to think the word transgressions and trespasses, what I was trying to do is to take this word that we use as sin and show how God does that over and over and over again throughout the Bible. And if that's sin, then I want to be a sinner, because that's what God does all the time, even against God's own people, word. Like, think about this. For Peter, that was God coming to him saying, everything you've been taught, right? Every theological concept you've ever had, everything grounded in Judaism, everything which is based in the segregation of the community, holiness for them meant separate. Yep. Right? That's what the word holy means, separate from Gentiles, right? Called apart so that they could be this people with special rules and laws and things. And the sheet comes down. This is why Peter had trouble. Sheet comes down and says, no, all of it's over. All of it's gone. All the boundaries between clean and unclean, holy and unholy, all that stuff, gone. And of course it took him 3 times. Probably take me 50, right? 100. I mean, I think that's the radical nature. What's God doing? God continues Transgressing. What does God do with the eunuch, right, on the road to Gaza? Transgresses every boundary that there was between the eunuch, the Ethiopian eunuch, and the community. What does God do at Pentecost? The Spirit comes and transgresses the boundaries between Israel and Gentiles through language, right? Using language. What does the Spirit do to Paul? Takes a murderer, right? A violent terrorist, turns him into the apostle for the Gentiles, right? Even before the rest of the church had figured out that the Gentiles were in, God sent a murderer to come tell them the Gentiles were in. Like, that's the craziness of this, and we can't lose that because the world has a different vision of Christianity that is all about transgressions and trespasses. And so I try to use that word intentionally in this because I see what the Spirit does and what God does all throughout the New Testament gospel, even in the Hebrew Bible, just constantly transgressing the boundaries that we've created, going against the very laws that we considered God's law, going against the very word that we consider God's word. You have heard it said, but I say. That's the story. And so we think that story ended at the last sentence in the book of Revelation. No, it didn't end there. It's still every day. You have heard it said, but I say. The Spirit's still speaking is what some churches say, right? And the Spirit is still transgressing. And the Spirit is still going against the laws and the traditions and the boundaries and the things that we have put up over the years. And there's going to be more of that because that's where the Spirit goes. And any community that is open to the Spirit doing that is going to feel that experience of it feeling like the walls are getting knocked down every few days, or every few years, so that new people can find their way into the center of the community. Like about the trespasses word, that's not the word in the Bible. That's a made-up word that Christian property owners created to make sure you understand what real sin is. What real sin for property owners is crossing into their territory when it doesn't belong to you. Now, the Bible did not have that concept of private property. So it was later Christians who had gotten very propertied in their life who put that word in and used that terminology. So it's a very capitalist translation of the Lord's Prayer. It's not what it says in Matthew. In Matthew and in Luke, it says debts. Yep. It's economic. It doesn't mean, now, and here's the thing. There's a couple of great books on this to read. But debt, the word for debt and the word for sin is the same word in many, many languages, going all the way back to Hebrew. So before the property decided that sin was crossing over into my territory without asking, before that, it was economic. Sin was always economic, right? In America, it's always sexual, according to the evangelicals, right? You know? But it used to be all economic. Sin was always economic. Then it became this kind of crossover the trespasses. So the appropriate translation is either debts or sins. Those are the only words that are ever used in the Lord's Prayer in the Bible. And so when we say it with trespasses, it's just, I don't like it personally. I just think it's not helpful. God is a trespasser. So why are we praying against trespassing? That's what God does. Why are we praying against transgressing? That's what God does. We should, so pray against something that God doesn't like, debt. Right? Yeah, I mean, pray a prayer that is biblical. Trespasses is not a biblical phrase, so I don't really appreciate it.
I've been praying about my student loan debt for a good while.
You've been praying on your student?
Come through,
yes.
God.
Come on now.
I'm in alignment.
Yes.
Excellent.
Don't let this debt ceiling thing get in the way.
Pesky courts. All right, so we have time for one more quick question. I've gone through all the questions I had written out. Is there someone here? I don't have any more on the email either. Was there anyone?
Nancy's got a question.
All right. You've got the mic, Nancy. It's okay, you're asking him, not me.
I'm curious about Lieutenant Ben, and how that translated. I mean, you felt called out of the military. What did that look like for you?
What did it look like? It was wild. It was wild. Some people, I had this happen to me all the time. Somebody will read my bio and then they will sit down to me after something and be like, I forgot you were in the Army. I forgot you were in the Army. And I'll be like, how'd you forget? But it's not the first thing that people think of, I think, anymore when they think of me. But it used to be. I mean, I graduated at the top of my military class. And I was hardcore. I mean, totally convinced that America was the purveyor of all good in the world. And that the best thing that I could do was to give my life to killing and destroying anyone who would stop America from being the purveyor of all good in the world. That's how far I was from where I am today. I really believed that. I was trained to believe that. I was taught to believe that. And I wasn't like, when I first got in the Army, I was a light wheel vehicle mechanic. That was my job. If you can believe me working on cars, it's not pretty. My dad can work on cars, but when I got that job, he just laughed at me. He said, there's no hope for you in the military. So I didn't stay that job very long. I thought, for a little while that I was going to maybe be a chaplain because I had this really powerful calling in life when I was 18 as a senior in high school. So I kind of thought that because I'd already joined the Army before then. I was already in the reserves before then. And then I thought, okay, how's God going to put these two callings together? Oh, I guess I'm going to have to be an Army chaplain. How's God going to put together this I'm in the Army, plus I feel called to ministry. What's going to be a chaplain? So then I kind of had that in my mind. God's going to figure this out when I went to military school. And then, very quickly there, I realized that chaplaincy was not going to save me in military school. And that just went out of my mind like the wind. I left military school as an infantry officer, right? So I'm not a vehicle mechanic anymore. I'm like the frontline soldiers is what I'm now trained to do. Running through the woods. I was an expert marksman, expert on grenades, shot every weapon you can possibly imagine that they've ever created, M16, M4s, AK-47s, drove tanks multiple times, was on tank ranges, artillery ranges, did all that stuff, jumped out of airplanes. I was an airborne infantry officer. I was hardcore. I was going for it. And so when it blew in, it was like, it took a while, I would say, is how I would say. It took a while for me to figure it out and say yes. It just was like, how did this happen? So what I sort of started to do was put some pieces in to see if it was real. So it was like, okay, well, let me go to divinity school and see. I showed up at divinity school the first day in my fatigues. I mean, I was crazy. Really, I was crazy. So, I mean, I didn't have them on when I left, but I had them on when I got there. It was just, that's who I was. So, divinity school, it saved me in a lot of ways. It helped me start to listen more. But I still hadn't figured out how to reconcile it. I still kept thinking it must be chaplaincy, and then on a lark, at the advice of a professor, I applied for a PhD program, and I got in, which was lucky. And I was like, oh my God, well, maybe it's education, right? And so I started going down that road, and I applied for an educational delay, another one. You can get one this was to keep me out of the Army, right? To keep me from having to go overseas. This was during Iraq, Afghanistan. They were both going on while I was on educational delay. And in fact, the soldier that we trained, that Sergeant Williams and I trained to take my job, to replace me when I got my educational delay, he lost his leg the first week in Iraq in a rollover. He was doing something stupid in a Humvee. He was West Point, so we don't trust them. And he did something really stupid and rolled over on himself and lost his leg. In the training, he was, unlike me, he didn't listen to a word Sergeant Williams said, and I knew he was in trouble. So anyway, so that's a whole side story. But I applied for another educational delay after Duke, thinking, okay, well, they'll let me get a degree. I was going to study war and peace and theology, and I thought maybe I'll study at an Army staff college, and I'll teach just war theory or something. And that's what I thought I was going to do as an officer. Man, I was so silly. I got a call from the chief of chaplains. This is a high-ranking person who somehow found me at the church in Alexandria, Virginia. I don't know where he got the number, but he called me on the church line. I'll never forget the secretary coming and bring me. He's like, this general so-and-so is on the line. So I pick up the phone, and it's this general. And this is during the Bush administration. They had just, what happens in the military is the same as appointments of government offices, where they take people that they like and put them into places of power. So this was a Bush appointee at the chief of chaplain's office. And he said, Lieutenant Boswell, where are you? So, I'm working at the church. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia. He said, well, what are you doing? It's time for you to report for orders. And I said, well, I applied for an educational delay. I'm working on a PhD at the Catholic University of America. I'm studying war and peace, and I'm, hoping one day to teach. I'll never forget the words he said to me. He said, we don't need people studying about whether or not to go to war. We're in a war. We need boots on the ground right now. He said, and if you think that this PhD thing that you're doing matters, I've got another thing to tell you about it. He said, we don't need people thinking about that. This fruitless pursuit that you're engaged in right now is not important to us. So if you want to continue to be, this is where I thought, I'm getting ready to go to war. I'm going to be sent to war. Then he said this, if you want to continue this, you tell me right now, and I'll send you your orders, and you're out of the Army tomorrow. And I said, all right, sounds good. And I was out of the Army like that. I got my honorable discharge the next day in the mail. I was over. The whole journey was over. So that's kind of how it happened for me. And then it was just a continued progression of trying to unlearn what I learned in the military. It was, it's indoctrination of a form of hatred, of teaching you. It starts with teaching you to talk about other people in the world in a way that makes it easier to kill them. It's very mental before it's ever physical. It's these people are this, right? There's all these names for the Viet Cong, right? That's what they were doing, training soldiers to dehumanize them in their minds to make it easier to kill them. So it took me years to unlearn that out of my head about Middle Eastern folks, Muslims, right? And that's an ongoing, that'll be a lifelong work for me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing such a big part of your journey. And thank you all for your great questions and your wonderful attention. So thank you all for making Talkback what it is. Can we just give one more round of applause and gratitude to Reverend Dr. Boswell? Thank you so much. Thank you all. We hope you'll stick with us again next week. Same time, same place, different person. All right. Have a great day.